What you say, baby? To my freedom, my freedom. Yeah, what did she say? What did she say?
Hey, hey, oh, 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 sing. I'm a time, then on the phone, then on the phone, then better. So readily I'm standing here right now, you're so demanding. Tell me what you want from me. Concluding, concentrating on my beauty lover and my babies. Let me wanna ask you later for a ticket out of town. So can I get a window? Hey,
Kia ora te whānau, nei rā te mihi kia koutou, and thank you so much for tuning in for another edition of He Rere Hua, a long-form interview that is unscripted and unedited and hopefully gently revealing, talking with people, about the things that matter to them in life. Our guest today is a noted historian and writer, Paul Moon, who joins us. Paul's a professor at AUT University here in Auckland. Thanks for joining us, Te Rangatira, Paul, and a pleasure to have a kōrero with you. Tēnā koe.
Kia ora, Dale. Good to see you.
And good to see you as well, mate. And we link arms via the net and on screen in digital ways that weren't available to us in years past, Mr. Moon. It's wonderful to have a kōrero with you. Paul's been a prolific writer, a man who's deeply interested in Māori issues, and a really interesting guy. Look, I'm pleased that we're talking with you in front of your library, Paul, because I know you're a writer, but I'm curious to know a little bit too about your reading and the things that interest you. But let's start with some information about you, Paul. Could you share a bit of kōrero about your whakapapa and where you grew up? A little bit about your old people, please, Paul.
Right. Well, my father's family came from England in the 1880s, and they settled in Auckland. One of them had a sister who married a person called Henry Brett, who ran the Auckland Star and became mayor of Auckland. So that was a wise marriage, and that ensured that the rest of us had jobs. So they've been in Auckland since then. My mother, you couldn't design a more different person. Her family came to New Zealand as refugees in the 1950s and 60s from the former Yugoslavia. They'd lost most of everything they had during the war. And after the war, the communists took over and confiscated all the land. So my grandfather said to some of his children, look, there's no future for you here. You've got to go somewhere else. And so a lot of them escaped across the border and ended up in refugee camps and got sent to New Zealand. So that's the sort of the two bits of my background.
The story of people from the Dalmatian coast, Dallies as we knew them, and of course, regardless, Yugoslavs. Now, it's taken quite a change, hasn't it, with references now to Croatian background or Serbian or Macedonian. We grew up at a time when they were all sort of lumped into Dallies, but the story of people from the Dalmatian coast and their intermarriage with Māori is really a really fascinating area. In fact, my own kids are involved in that as well, Paul. What would you say are some of the dynamics? Because when a lot of the people from that area arrived in New Zealand, they were deemed Austrians and really in some ways at the bottom of the pecking order, Paul.
That's right. Well, my mum comes actually just a bit further south in Montenegro, just south of the Dalmatian coast, same bit of coast, just further south. Very much so. In fact, a lot of the reason for intermarriage was that the people from that part of the world felt discriminated against when they arrived here. They spoke a funny language, which became known as tarara because it sounded like tara, 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 tara. So they had to struggle with the language. They didn't have anything in the way of money, not much in the way of education. So a very difficult place to make a start in. And I think culturally there may have been some similarities, perhaps, who knows.
Some fascinating people have emerged from there, and through the liaisons, are very special people that we know as tarara. These are those with that Māori and Dalmatian, Yugoslav or Croatian connections. Thank you, Paul. So where did you grow up? I'm keen to understand your deep interest in things Māori, how that came to be. Tell us about schooling and suburbs and where you sort of who helped shape you as a young guy, personality-wise, Paul?
I think, like everyone, the cauldron of family dynamics shapes you a lot, for good and bad. But I grew up in Massey in West Auckland. I was at a function a few years ago, and this woman said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I teach and I write history." She goes, "Oh, I'm writing a book about a school." It was a very revolutionary school. And I said, "Oh, what's that?" She said, "Lincoln Heights Primary School in the 1960s and 70s. And I said, "Well, I actually went there because it was just around the corner from where I lived." But it was sort of an experimental school at the time. My parents sent me there simply because it was close. It was the nearest school. But we had a class, for example, I think in what was then Standard 2, where we did almost no reading or writing or maths for the whole year. It was just pottery and lino cuts and art and all that sort of stuff. And that was a very interesting experience. Then I went to Massey High School, same school as Dean Lonergan, which is our claim to fame. And that was an interesting school as well. And then went on to Auckland University and did a BA there. I took a year off and I went to stay with my grandparents in Montenegro. And then I came back and finished it. And then after a while, I ended up working at Te Whānau Waipareta Trust with John Tamihere. And that was, again, another interesting experience, a very dynamic place in the early 90s. I know everyone has their opinion of John. My view of him, and it's just my view, he's an extraordinarily talented person, but I sort of saw a side of him. He'd go out of his way to help people without looking for credit, and also in times when he didn't need to help people. And I think, as I say, no matter what people think of him or see in his public persona, that always stayed with me. He was a hugely impressive person and a very caring person. And as I say, there were times when he didn't need to lift a finger, but he chose to intervene, to help, to assist someone where he could have just said, "Well, no, it's not my job." So I was there for about 18 months. And then Toby Curtis, who worked at what's now AUT, he came to visit us one day at Waipareta, and he offered me a job. And I said, "Oh, okay then." So I'd known Toby since I was about 5 or 6, because they were near neighbours. The Curtises lived not far from us. So I said, I looked into that, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting." So that was 1992, and then at the end of 92, he offered the job, and then I started 93 AUT and have been there since.
Which is an amazing and lengthy career at AUT. And Paul's written many publications about issues Māori over the years, some of them somewhat controversial for various reasons, because he backs himself and does his research really well. I'm interested too in how that year you spent with your old people in Montenegro, how that helped to shape some of your perspectives about peoples globally, but also about how the intersection with Māori interests occurred for those peoples. What did you learn from that experience, being away from NZ for a year in Montenegro?
I'd always thought that, when I was much younger, that if you have two different cultures as part of your background, you'll become a fusion of the two, a mixture of the two. What that trip confirmed to me is that you don't. You actually shift from one to another, and you're forever negotiating and navigating where you are. A friend of mine who's an accountant, and very successful accountant, works for a major city firm, lives in Ponsonby. He's from Ngāpuhi, and he described it to me best. He said every November he starts to feel a bit suffocated by the Pākehā world. And he's looking forward to Christmas because he goes back up north with his family. And he said, once you leave north of Auckland and you're into the countryside heading north, he said, it's like that blanket's been lifted off him, that suffocating blanket of the Pākehā world. And he's entering to what's special for him, what's precious for him. And when he arrives and he spends the first week or so just fishing, swimming, joking around with everyone in his jandal shorts and t-shirts, and he feels like he's connected. But what's interesting is he said by the second week, he's starting to get a bit tired of that. He wants to go back to Auckland. The very thing he wanted to leave, he now wants to go back to, and he's starting to feel suffocated by where he is. And that struck home for me, that you're constantly negotiating between two different poles. You don't become a mixture of the two. You sort of bounce around and oscillate between them. And I think that's what that experience showed.
We're lucky that we have these pieces of whenua, which we call home, and even noting that once there, you might hark for a return back to the bright lights. Is there a place for you that does a similar thing, that settles you and grounds you, because you lead a busy life yourself at AUT? We're lucky, Māori, that we've got these pockets of land, albeit much of it now compromised, and we'll go into that in a mo. But is there somewhere special for you, Paul, where you recharge?
No, and I make a point of that. I don't want to be connected to anything. And it sounds a bit silly perhaps, but I'm not especially concerned with issues of identity either. I think there's enough going on in the world without worrying about that. And I see also some people make it almost a fetish that this is part of me and so on. And there are good psychological explanations for that. And I know members of my own family have that. But no, I deliberately go out of my way not to be connected to any place or any particular sense of identity.
Oh, Paul, come on now, Paul. Can you flesh that out again? That you're cautious about issues of identity. What are you getting at there?
Well, at its extreme, if I exaggerated, for one or two people, it almost imprisons them, because when they feel this is my identity, then they have to perform according to that identity. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, but my own preferences, I have no interest in it. I amputate that part of my past from me because it just doesn't, to me, serve any purpose. I'm just a mixture of all sorts of bits and bobs glued together. And I could spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and expend a lot of energy saying, well, this is my identity, this is my culture, this is my whatever. And I'm aware of it and it interests me, but it's certainly not something I'm wedded to.
That's interesting. Have people wondered about your motives, because you delve into Māori issues in your professional and academic life? It's been a bit of a hallmark of yours, interested in Māori history. But I get the impression that in some ways you prefer for yourself not to look back.
I certainly don't look back, because you can't. I mean, we've all got a lot of things in our lives that, call it wreckage or whatever. We could keep revisiting it. It's not particularly productive to do that. I like to look forward to what's happening now and what's going to happen. As for my interest in certain topics, a lot of that hasn't been of my own will or decision. I haven't sat down. I've never done this. I've never sat down and said, this is my plan for the next 2 years or something. I don't have plans, because there's enough evil in one day, as the Bible says. Don't worry about the future. And so I think there's a lot of truth in that. How I got involved in it was that I actually got asked. I was doing a bit of research on the treaty, but a particular whānau approached me and said, look, we want you to research our ancestor. There's a guy, Graham Rankin, who passed away about 23, 24 years ago. And I carried out that research, and then that led on to other things, and other people asked me and so on. And I think why I've kept doing it is partly because I am very interested in it, but partly because people have come to trust me. And an example of that, the only time I've ever contacted someone to write a book was a couple of years ago, I contacted the photographer Hans Westra, who'd produced Wash Day at the Pa in the 60s, a book that was subsequently banned and destroyed. And I was very interested, and she was in her mid-80s at the time, and I thought, well, she won't have long. And she didn't. She died shortly before I finished the book. But I wanted to find out about her life. It was extraordinary. She had a 60-year career. And so I sent her a message on LinkedIn, which is a social media networking thingy. And I just said, my name is Paul Moon. I'm a historian. I'd like to meet you to consider writing a book about you. It's the only time I've ever done this. And it shows when someone's read the message, and she read the message half an hour later. And then I sort of waited, and the next couple of days, there's no reply. Next couple of weeks, and no reply. After about 3 months, I thought, well, that's it. And it was only about 4 months later, her agent contacted me and said, look, she'd like to meet you. And I thought, that's a big delay. What I wasn't aware of is that she had a huge network, and she was contacting people in her network to find out, was I trustworthy? Was I reliable? Could I do the job? And I think the reason why I do get approached, or part of the reason, is that people know that, I'm not going to make a nuisance of their lives, or not going to, divulge things I shouldn't. And I carry around certain bits of information. Some of it I will release. I did a book on Hane Manahi, the Te Arawa soldier who fought in the 28 Maori Battalion, who was recommended at the very highest level. Field Marshal Montgomery himself recommended Manahi for a VC. Manahi didn't get the VC. And many years later, after Manahi had died, there was a campaign to get his VC awarded. And I know exactly who sabotaged that campaign. I know the person who did it, and I know the informant. I have to wait for both of them to pass away, and then I'll reveal exactly what happened. So there are things I do know that I can't reveal for defamation reasons, but by and large, I do keep things very confidential.
Tēnā koe. Our guest today on He Rere Hoa is Professor Paul Moon, a noted historian and prolific author. I'm just looking at a list of some of the books you've written about, and Paul kindly just mentioned Arns, Hohepa Keriopa, The Rise and Fall of James Busby. I'm just picking some of these out. The Life of Augustus Earl, Victoria Cross at Tukruna, New Zealand birth certificates, 50 of New Zealand's founding documents, the Tohunga Journal, the newest country in the world, Hone Heke, Ngāpuhi Warrior, the seabed deal. A lot of what has occurred for Māori has remained unresolved. And when we look at the huge loss of land, of culture, of language, etc., these are points that haven't completely played out through the colonisation process and still have a way to go. You've noted that our people are looking backwards and looking for redress, apologies, at sometimes compensation. Is that useful, or do you sense for Māori that it's keeping us locked to the past in ways that might be stymieing our way forward?
It's both. When something alters the balance of what should be, there's something deep inside our brains and some recess at the back of our heads that says we need to restore that balance. And you're never quite comfortable until it's restored. And some people don't get this, but I think it's critical. And some cultures, it's more pronounced than others. That's largely an economic and physical act, but it has all sorts of other repercussions. It has repercussions psychologically. It absolutely has repercussions in terms of economics and opportunity for subsequent generations. It has consequences for where you live and how you attach yourself and sense of identity for some people. So that imbalance that's caused, say, by confiscation needs to be restored. So setting the balance, re-establishing it is important. One of the fishhooks in all this, of course, is that you can never do that. You can never completely restore what's lost. So if you've got 4 or 5 generations of your family that's suffered extreme hardship and deprivation as a consequence of a land confiscation, you might get the land returned, but you can't undo those 4 or 5 generations of experience. Those people have gone to their graves having suffered. You can't undo that. So there are real challenges when it comes to restoring balance. And at some point, maybe it's a case that you have to say, well, and I remember talking to Tipene O'Regan about this. He said we need to get out, his words, we need to get out of the grievance mode and into the development mode. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the answer either, because that grievance mode, actually, it's a wrong term that he used, I think, but that sense of grievance is always going to be there. If someone's done you something bad, you don't just pretend it never happened. You know, if I punch you in the face, you're not going to say tomorrow, oh, that was yesterday, we'll forget about it. You start to wonder what's going on in my attitude that made me do that to you. Can I deal with this person? What are my relations? All these sorts of things are still present. So it's very easy for people to say, let's put it into the past. It's gone now. That's it. On the other hand, though, you've got to ask yourself, what's the consequence if you're preoccupied with something that happened in the past? Does that affect the way you behave now? And you can see in all parts of the world, and former Yugoslavia is a really good example, people dredging up things that happened in 1389, and they talk about it as though it happened yesterday, and they go to war over it, and they kill each other over it. It's intensely personal, this history, and the sense of grievance is personal. I just wonder, at what point do you relinquish it? At what point do you say, well, we've reached the expiry date now. We'll always remember it, but we can't be controlled by it. And the worst thing in the world would be for me to say, this is the answer, because there is no answer. And everyone deals with this and encounters it differently.
Thank you. Paul Moon is our guest on He Rere Hua today, and I thank you for listening. And Paul, there's been criticism of the tribunal. We know that the settlement regime is really only, well, since 95. So, we're talking only 31 years here. Is it still fit for purpose from your read? And when we look at stats, social stats, housing, health, employment, education, for instance, our people Māori are always dragging the chain in the numbers. But is that something that we can or should anticipate and expect, and that it is still part of the ongoing process of colonisation that we're dragging behind? But do you sense that we will catch up, that these figures of incarceration, of poor health, of poor education stats will eventually right themselves?
In the 1920s, in Inland Bay of Plenty, Pākehā lived in places like Whakatane, would go for Sunday drives sometimes. And they'd drive by all those Māori houses inland in the Bay of Plenty. And the reason they drove past them was to look at them, because these houses had immaculate flower beds in the front of them. Very roughly, a lot of Pākehā cleaned out their fireplaces once or twice a week. These houses, the occupants clean them out every day. They're immaculately maintained with beautiful gardens, and it's almost something we can't imagine now, but Pākehā going for Sunday drives past Māori houses to marvel at how impressive they were, how clean they were, how well looked after they were. That doesn't happen now. So something's happened in the last 100 years that's been quite concerning. If you look at little signs, what Māori were petitioning the government for in the 1870s, they're saying, we want better educational opportunities for our children. They were the ones pushing for it, not officials, not government ministers, not educationalists. Māori parents were pushing for better education. You see the fruits of that, the end of the 19th century, that large numbers of Māori start to attain high levels of education. Something was lost after that, and it might have to do with urban migration, I don't know, but these were communities that had very high standards in all sorts of areas, despite not having resources. You look at some of these very impoverished communities, particularly rural communities at the beginning of the 20th century, and you think, well, if you're born into that community, you've got no chance. In actual fact, a lot of those people became very successful. As I say, something has been lost in the last 100 years, but I get the sense that it's being reclaimed. And certainly we see huge number of Māori involved in areas like education, probably disproportionately high. We see a disproportionately high number of Māori represented as members of parliament, higher than the proportion of the population. So I think whatever did go wrong in say the last 100 years, that's being remedied, and it takes time to work its way through the system. It's rather like when you take a antibiotic or something, it'll take a while to do its work. But I think things are turning around, and And that's before we even start to think about major iwi corporations, which are phenomenally successful. Being in Auckland, you notice this with Ngāti Whātua, I'm not talking about financial success, I'm talking about the fact that they've had a direct influence on how Auckland physically looks, our skyline, some of the design features. And we've got to be eternally grateful for groups like that, because they've made big improvements to the city. So when we talk about bad statistics, yes, they're there, but there's absolutely a turnaround taking place.
Tēnā koe. Paul Moon is with us today, professor at AUT University here in Auckland. Can we touch on the education system? Because the 9 till 3 style, which is very old, and the imported way of education, i.e. there's all the 5-year-olds, let's put them in a class and sit on the mat, the 6-year-olds as well. Does that fit the Māori model or the Māori dynamic? Because we still maintain it, even though it might be worth considering how we conduct our teaching, our lessons. Many of our people, especially younger Māori guys, might do better learning in outdoor environments rather than, on laptops or the like, pieces of paper in a classroom with a desk. Do you think we're still utilising an antiquated system of education? And quite obviously, the Stats Māori would suggest it's not working for us. Some thoughts down that lane, please, Paul.
Well, no, when I was at primary school, I always looked out the window thinking I'd love to be outside. I didn't really enjoy being inside at all. So I think it's perhaps a male thing more than anything. I'm really cautious when people listen to this. Again, go back 1920s, 30s, and I look at exercise books from Māori students at that time. The handwriting's immaculate. The expression, the writing style is way ahead of people of that age. I'm talking about people who say 10 or 11, writing like 17, 18-year-olds. And that was a far more rigid, strict system then. And I get a bit cautious when people say, well, perhaps it doesn't suit our style, because the counter of that is, well, perhaps we're not adaptable enough. And I think if you look at the last 200 years of New Zealand history, Māori are the most adaptable group in the country in terms of the transition that's been imposed on them and the response to it. And you look at, again, that cluster of people up at Ananata, Pōmare, Carroll, Honeke Ngāpua, all highly educated, highly successful, but coming from a very, very traditional background. And obviously it worked for them. So I think there are other things at play as well. And the fact is now we've got, and this is one thing we've got to really, I think, cut ourselves loose from, is the idea of being Māori somehow represents a lower echelon or less success, because more and more we're seeing the opposite is true. The very top levels in professions, the very top levels in all sorts of areas, in education and so on, you see Māori there. If the system wasn't working for them, how do they succeed to that point, those people? And so there are probably other factors at play as well.
Sometimes I feel sorry for people who haven't warmed to Māori ways of thinking, that our sense of tauranga, our knowledge systems have been honed across thousands of years. And there's something simple about what we believe to be right and wrong. And I wonder whether or not you think that there are some, I've heard it described as an inappropriate sense of self. I mean, hey, I'm proud of our Māori sides, but you say that these identity issues can be problematic. Whilst we might acknowledge, I mean, I never thought of ourselves at the bottom of the heap, rather I think of us as being at the top. But are there dangers in that?
I think the real danger is when you get some people saying we're not going to have any, or we don't want any Māori content in what we teach. We don't want cultural elements in what we teach, because school's about reading and writing. And, if you want to do your cultural thing, wonderful, knock yourself out, but we're not going to have that in schools. That's fundamentally an anti-education, anti-intellectual approach. If someone's offering you the opportunity to learn about another way of seeing and doing and thinking, you rush towards that opportunity. You don't block it out. And I think there's much more, or there ought to be much more of a role for culture in what happens in schools. As you say, this is a culture that might be in this country from the 1200s, but it has roots going back to Polynesia for thousands of years. And you ignore that at your peril. If you say that's of no real value to the modern world, I think that's quite an ignorant approach to thinking. There's so much we can learn from different ways of thinking and seeing. And so I think we ought to be focused on that rather than shunning it.
What do you make of the connections being made into Indigenous or First Nations? I'm talking with the Aboriginal people, with our Pacific whānau, and we could even go home to Montenegro as well, to those First Nations concepts that have a, would it be wrong to use the word purity about them before they were compromised by commercial interests and capitalist goals, etc. What are you making of our people Māori trying to make connections with the Inuit people, with the First Nations people of the States, in fact, First Nations and Indigenous people globally?
One of the amazing things about it, and I think you've hit the nail on the head, before advanced industrial capitalism hit countries, is that First Nations people have almost an intuitive sense of connection before they even speak to each other and they meet for the first time. You look at each other and you know there's that something clicks. And I don't want to sound dismissive, but I don't think for a lot of the Pākehā world that happens. They don't have that sense of, that intuitive sense of we understand each other. And so there absolutely is a distinction about being a First Nations person or an Indigenous person. And I think also coming with that is a degree of fragility and vulnerability. As much as it's pronounced and put on show and paraded that this is our Indigenous culture, I get the sense that beneath that there is a degree of fragility, and there needs to be, because the threats posed to Indigenous cultures are probably greater now than ever. And those threats aren't people going out trying to ban it. It's the biggest threat is indifference. Young people going, I don't care. I'm obsessed by my phone. I look at that. I go, my mates, I don't need that. So that's the bigger threat. So the sense of indigeneity is perhaps more fragile than people realise, but there is that connection globally, no question about it.
Yeah, interesting that you touch on that technical aspect and how it's coming to sort of dominate our world. As you have no doubt, I think I was at an event the other day and everybody was on their phone. They weren't talking with each other. It's a vastly different world. Good or a bad thing, Paul?
Oh, it's absolutely a bad thing. I remember I asked Hoipa Kiriopa once, we're talking about te reo, and I said, do you think the language will ever disappear? And he goes, no. And I said, but there's fewer people who are fluent native speakers, And he said, it's not about the words, it's about the thinking. He said, when two Maori who've never seen each other before approach each other at an event or something, he said, before they open their mouths, they're speaking te reo, just by the way they move, by the way they look. He said it's much more than just the words. And in a digital world, a lot of that personal, historical, cultural connection, that intuitive connection, can get lost. That's one problem. The other much bigger problem, of course, is with AI. So what happens when AI starts producing its own myths and legends? What happens when AI starts producing its own books about Maori history and so on? What happens when AI starts producing its own reports to supplement or replace those of the Waitangi Tribunal? And you might think, well, yeah, that's AI, we'll ignore it, but they'll get a point we won't be able to tell the difference. And so there's all sorts of risks for the sort of contamination we can't even imagine at this stage. It would be that bad.
Well, the cat's out of the bag. We can't put it back in either, it would seem. So how much of a threat is it to this intuitive kaupapa that you've just raised? And it resonated with me too, Paul, so I thank you for it, that there's something intrinsic about meeting somebody we can wander through any city of the world and you'll see a person, you think, I think he's Māori, and next thing you know, you got the eyebrow, that one going on, the flick of the eyebrows, and you realise, yeah, he is Māori, and there's something that immediately draws you together. But this threat of technology, and particularly AI, might we just flesh that out a little bit more, how it could compromise this intuitive nature, this taonga that exists between us. And I don't know a lot about AI, but I know it's increasingly sophisticated and it's becoming more and more a part of our everyday lives. What are the pros and cons from your read, Paul?
Well, when it comes to social media and phones and so on generally, before we get to AI, that's definitely having an isolating effect, and it's having a reculturalization effect, if you could call it that, in the sense that what is my culture? Well, if my culture is basically an American hip-hop culture, and that's where a lot of my language comes from, a lot of my affinity goes towards, that's exercising a gravitational force on how I identify myself. And there is a culture of young people across all ethnicities now that is orienting itself towards something outside of this country. So we're sort of losing a lot of that, what we had, say, 50, 60 years ago. It's a very different landscape now culturally, especially for young people. The problems with AI are much bigger than most people, I suspect, realize. In fact, all of us realize. So take, for example, a book. Let's say there's a book written by, I don't know, Peter Buck wrote a book. And that book's a useful reference book for aspects of culture. Great, we read it. Where do we read it? We read it on a screen because it's just difficult to get to a library and you've got to interloan it and whatever. So we read it on a screen. No problem there, except that how do you know that's the real book? And with AI, we could get variants of that book. So there could be 10,000 different versions, slightly different versions of the book with the text modified by AI, which is the real one. Well, it might be a case in 5, 10 years you don't know, unless you have the physical copy. So in a totally digital world, which is totally open to manipulation and augmentation, the security and the certainty of what we're reading goes. How do we judge these things? So if there's testimony from Kaumatua and we read it online, what if that's been modified by AI? And what if AI starts to modify other AI testimony? How do we know what's real?
Well, it's an issue that we're all grappling with, and it's right upon us. So something we have to be very mindful of. Paul Moon, Professor Paul Moon, is our guest today on Here Hoa. This one size fits all. This is sort of political ideology. I hear it a lot from David. Also, you've got Winston with a sort of loyalist, wants sort of style and wants us to remain, I guess, the younger cousin of Great Britain. And then we've got Māori seeking sort of more mana motuhake, more decision-making in our ways going forward. How difficult is it for Māori interests, do you believe, in 2026 to advance issues that are important to us, taonga to us, in a political climate that prefers to have a cookie-cutter attitude towards Ngāi Māori interests and suggests that we're all the same?
Well, let's be clear. The political environment encourages division. That's at the heart of what Parliament is. Parliament isn't everyone on the same side. It's everyone opposing other groups. How do you accentuate that division? Well, sometimes you need a whipping boy. Sometimes you need a group that you can just hurl your abuse at and say, this is one of the causes of the problem. This is the group that we need to fix them, all this sort of thing. And it might be, look, we're going to implement special programs to help this group. All those things, the hostile ones are obvious. This group is a problem. That's an obvious comment. But even saying we need to help this group, that can be a bit paternalistic as well. The fact is that if you look from before human beings arrived here, the first humans who arrived, the first Polynesians, overcame one of the biggest challenges of any people in history to cross that ocean with that technology and with those sorts of vessels. It's one of the biggest challenges. If you can achieve that and then arrive at a place that's totally unfamiliar and develop a whole new indigenous culture from that, and a very intricate culture, if you can then adjust to 150 odd years of rapid colonization, rapid modernization, including a complete change in language that you speak, if you can adjust to all those things, then it becomes really odd when someone says, well, this group is not succeeding, or this group needs help, or whatever. I don't think that's the case. I think what you see around the world, and this has always been the case, when people begin to organize themselves in a way that fits their requirements, that's what works best for that group. And it works best for us too. You try to live in any environment where someone else is telling you how you should be, what you should think, and so on. It's fine when you're a kid, but when you're an adult, that's suffocating. And so the experience from everywhere shows that people who have some degree of autonomy, now that can be within a state, the state can allow that sort of freedom, but it needs to be driven by the people concerned, not by outsiders. And so I think I'm a bit reluctant when you see politicians of any colour saying this is what this group needs. It's up to the group to say what it needs and leave it at that.
Yeah, I took all what you're saying there. Rangi Walker, Rangi Nui says, it's a struggle without end, and each of us play our part in what is a long game. You and I will be well gone. The fight goes on to address injustices of yesteryear, and of course, when we look at the treaty and the implication that it would have a shared future, but all of a sudden have fully adopted the Westminster system and Māori forced to operate and accommodate that system. There's many hoping that here in little old Aotearoa, I don't even like the name New Zealand, but that's another issue, Paul. We'll park up for a moment. That we've been forced to be served by a political system that is imported, and the potential for us to merge the great mātauranga of the Pacific peoples into the best of Westminster still exists. Is it ever achievable, or do you sense that it is a worthy goal and a worthy fight to get to that place?
Systems tend to be very protective of themselves, so I wouldn't hold out a lot of optimism for saying you can work in this system and change it. There'll be accommodations, but anyone who looks to politics for the answers probably asking the wrong question. If you want to express things, if you want to achieve sort of independence in the sense of cultural and even economic, then the answers lie outside the political system. And you can see that with other groups. You can see that the other immigrant groups that maintain their culture and so on, they don't look to Parliament for a solution because they know that's not the place to look. They develop systems within themselves, cultural systems that perpetuate what's important to them across generations. As for struggle without end, I actually had a chat with Rangi shortly before he died about that very comment. And his view of the world was that there were oppressors and the oppressed. And the oppressed are always going to be struggling against the oppressors. And I said to him that I fundamentally disagreed. I said, I wouldn't want to be part of a group that has to struggle without end. It sounds very noble and heroic and so on, but it's just a lot of expended effort. And he saw my point, I saw his point. But I think it's an interesting way to approach life. If you approach life with this idea that, for our existence to continue, it's going to be a constant struggle. Now, that may be the case, but struggle without end, that says to me, well, we haven't actually got a destination point in mind. It's always going to be a battle. And that can be tiring. And what happens with a long battle is you get attrition. People just fall off and they go, I can't be bothered. That world's not for me because it's constant struggle. It's constant, So reframing what the issues are, and I don't know what the answer is, but certainly reframing the challenge could be an interesting thing to do, rather than seeing it as an oppressor-oppressed dynamic with, we've got to keep struggling, keep fighting for our language, for our culture, for our space, for our survival. Others see it differently. Other cultural minorities see it differently. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, and very interesting. The changing dynamic through intermarriage, where one day most people will have some whakapapa Māori. So this is one issue that's changing the demography of our land, plus also many other people are calling this place home as well. Paul, they bring an interesting and challenging dynamic into our collective futures. What thoughts as we I'm looking at the clock with about 6 minutes to go. What thoughts about this very obvious change in the demography of our land?
And you're right. And so if you look at the 1890s, Māori comprised about 5% of the population. 60 years before was about 99%. Now, there's no other ethnic group I know of in the world that's had that rapid drop in 60 years, from being 99% to being 5%. So there's no precedent for it. There's no way of looking elsewhere to say this is how you deal with that, because that collapse was catastrophic. And yet it's changing, as you say, in the other direction now, where we're getting roughly 19-20% of the population Maori, and that's predicted to grow as a proportion of the whole. One of the things you see is that, as a general rule, demographics does have an influence on politics. So if you're to make a prediction, and I'm not in the prophecy business, but if you were, you'd say, in the future, Maori are going to be a high proportion of voters. They're a younger population. So the chances are that decisions made by Parliament increasingly will reflect that cohort. But here's the thing. What does that cohort think or believe? And that's really what it comes down to. If we're just looking at numbers and so Maori might be 25, 35%, 40% of the population in a generation, or 50% or 60 in 2 generations, that's all interesting, but what values do they hold? What's their perception of themselves? And unless that has some coherence, then the numbers don't mean anything.
Tēnā koe. The work you've done is important. We need references to be able to look back so we can chart a way forward. And I look at the volume of work and very much respect how you've committed yourself. And it interests me that you've crossed paths with blokes like Tamihere in his younger days out on the blue sheds in Henderson, and then Toby Curtis, who was instrumental in my broadcast career too, because at that same time he was with AUT. He was chair of the Waatea Radio Trust, if you might recall.
Yes, that's right. And I think he's involved in Te Mangai Paho and a few others. Yeah, he was.
Yeah, surely.
He was a force of nature.
Tēnā koe. I'm always interested in books because some can be very influential in how we see the world, and good books can make you go, wow, and it can impact you. You've got a stack of them behind you, but would you be kind enough to point to one or two that you might recommend people interested in this area that you've delved into, Māori history, and moving forward, that have left their mark on you, Paul?
Well, most of my work's in archives, so funny enough, not very many books. I do a lot in sort of, archival sources and interviews and so on. Funny enough, no, I mean, my own personal reading is really only 1 week a year. And I might just read whatever's hanging around, but I tend not to read during the year anything other than research related. So, but I think, if you want some quite good reading, look at the 2014 Waitangi Tribunal report for the Ngāpuhi sovereignty claim. It's what's roughly referred to as. And that gives you a good general background of a whole lot of issues connected with sovereignty and the treaty and so on. And it's not a difficult read, and it's available free. There's a PDF of it. So Waitangi Tribunal material on that is really useful.
And just finally, have we cause to be somewhat optimistic about our collective futures as people who call this land home?
I don't know, because I don't know what optimism would look like, what it's optimistic for, what's the end goal. I don't think there's an archetypal utopian model that this is where we're going to, and we're a bit closer now. I think if people sort of live each day by certain values that inform how you react with others, that's the best we can hope for.
It's been a pleasure talking with you, Paul. Thanks again. Thanks for all the mahi you've been doing and will continue to do. And thank you for kindly joining us to talk about aspects of life in this way, and appreciate your thoughts and time today at Te Rangatira. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much.
Kia ora, that's Professor Paul Moon, our special guest today on He Rehua. Long form, unedited, unscripted, and hopefully gently revealing kōrero. Thank you so much for once again joining us here on Waatea for this hōtaka. And I hope that if you enjoyed some of what you heard today, you'll be kind enough to do it all again. From me, Dale, and CJ Lenati, who engineered our program today, I want to wish you well for the day ahead. Me hane kia koutou i o koutou manakitangi o koutou tautoko o tēnei hōtaka. Tēnā koutou e homa. Tēnā koutou e homa. Me hane e homa. And hopefully we'll get a chance to do it all again one day soon. Have a good day. Mōri ora.
Kei ngā reo, kei ngā mana, putano I te motu, whakapiri mai anō ki te reorirangi o Waatea, kawe ake nei ngā pūrongo o te haora ki a koutou, nā runga no hoki te pūtea tautoko a te māngai pāho. E whai ake nei e te iwi, ai rānei ko te pūrongo mātika mai, te huarahi, hei whai mā tātou e te tuki ai ngā wawata, I wawata tia ai I roto I te tiriti o Waitangi. Ana, he aha ko ia tēnei rōpū te taumata rangatira, nā te aha rātou I hui ai ki te premier I tērā wiki, me ngā hā kinikina e whai ake nei. Hakua tōna te koutou pea te tawhito kei te hāngai tonu ngā kōrero I tuhia I roto I te pūrongo mātika mai. Hei arahi ia tātou I roto I tā tātou whai. Kia mahi tahi te karauna me te Māori I roto I tēnei whenua o tira. Kia mahi tahi o rangatira ki te rangatira mana ki te mana. Kia tahuri ake tātou kia Huhana Linden o ngā kākāriki.
He timatanga tērā pūrongo mai tike mai. Koia tētahi o ngā raru o tēnei hanga whare pāremata o Inaia nei, nā tā wāhi tonu. Koia te inoi me te pātai. Hea ka tū tētahi wānanga ki te hanga tētahi pāremata kia manaai te tiriti o Waitangi. Tētahi kāwanatanga e whakahōnore ana I te tiriti me te tuakana tērā papapaunamu o he whakapūtanga. Koia tētahi o ngā raru kua kite ahau, nā te mea ko te mana o te kāwanatanga, tētahi mea rereke ki tā te rangatiratanga o te iwi Māori. Me tētahi whare e tūraki ana, e rawe ke tonu ana I te tiriti, me te tino rangatiratanga o tō tātou iwi. Nō reira, kua tai ki te wā. Kau e tatari mō tētahi atua, kua tai ki te wā.
Ko tētahi o ngā hui nui I Waitangi I tēnei tau, ko te hui a te rōpū taumata rangatira ki te kāwanatanga o tira ki te premier. He aha tēnei mea te taumata rangatira, he aha hoki ngā kōrero mō ngā kaupapa I āta wānanga hia. E te taumata rangatira I te taha o te kāwanatanga. Kia tahuri ake tātou, kia Peter Lucas Jones, hea mana o te aupauri.
Whakaaro hoki ngā mema o tēnei rōpū I te anga whakamua mō ngā kaupapa maha kei mua I te aroaro o ngā iwi o te hiko o te ika. Mo te tā ki te aupauri ko te ohanga tēnā. Ngā ahunga whenua, ngā ahunga moana, kia whai wāhi hoki